Welcome to another Bio 151 lecture. A few announcements before we get started. Your sapling homeworks for chapter 46 and 47 are due on Sunday by 11:59 p.m. Your office hours are on Zoom on Tuesday and Thursday from 1 to 3. To access the office hours, see the link on our Canvas page. So today we're going to be talking about ecosystem ecology. So we're looking at a very big picture of ecosystems. And when you think about some really dynamic ecosystems, one of the most dynamic in the world are coral reef ecosystems. And they support a wide range of biodiversity. And we're going to talk about some of the reasons why that's possible today. And then we'll talk more about it in our next lecture. Another place that has a large amount of biodiversity are rainforests, which tropical rainforests are found near the equator, and they harbor a wide range of animals, and this is because of plants and the wide diversity of plants that are in these ecosystems. So when we're thinking about ecosystem ecology, it might seem a little strange, but we actually think about it typically by the cycling of particular resources and nutrients through the ecosystem. And one of the most important resources that cycles through ecosystem is carbon. The carbon cycle is the intricately linked network of biological and physical processes that shuttle carbon among rocks, soil, oceans, airs, and organisms. The carbon cycle provides a fundamental organizing principle for understanding life on Earth. Geologic evidence tells us that on timescales of thousands of millions of years, carbon dioxide levels in the air have changed over time. And we'll talk more about that later in the lecture. To understand how biological and physical processes interact to govern carbon dioxide levels in the air, we must look at how carbon is distributed among its various reservoirs, the places where carbon is found on Earth. Carbon is stored in the organisms living on land and in the soil by decaying organic compounds. It's found in the oceans as inorganic carbon and in very small amounts in the living organisms in oceans. The largest reservoir, so where carbon is stored on Earth, is within the sediments and sedimentary rock. So most of the carbon on our planet is stored in the sedimentary rock. Fluxes are the rate at which carbon flows from one reservoir to another. The sensitivity of different reservoirs to change depends on the relative sizes of the reservoir and the movement of material into and out of it. Atmospheric carbon dioxide abundance can be influenced by a number of processes at work in the carbon cycle. So where is most of our carbon stored on Earth? Carbon dioxide is added to the atmosphere by a few different processes, and these include geological inputs such as from volcanic eruptions and from the plate tectonics that are happening deep within the ocean. There's also biological inputs such as respiration. So every time we're breathing, we're releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and that's true for all living organisms on Earth. We also add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere through human activities, such as deforestation and burning fossil fuels. So burning fossil fuels, such as coal, is releasing a lot of carbon dioxide as we burn those because those are reservoirs for carbon dioxide. When we cut down trees, that carbon dioxide that was stored in the tree is then released into the atmosphere. And so if we look at this figure here, this top one is the production of carbon dioxide by human activities. And you can see that here's deforestation, but the biggest amount of carbon dioxide that humans add is through the burning of fossil fuels, such as coal, natural gas, and petroleum. Carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere by a few different ways. It's removed geologically, such as the chemical weathering of rocks, and biologically, through photosynthesis. So remember, when plants and other primary producers do photosynthesis, they're taking in that carbon dioxide to be able to make energy for themselves. Geological processes play key roles in the carbon cycle on the timescales of centuries or longer. So if we look at the second figure here, we can see the fate of human-generated carbon dioxide. A lot of it goes into the oceans. Some is accumulated on land through vegetation and soil, but a large chunk of it is in the atmosphere as well. Humans add about 9 billion metric tons of carbon to the atmosphere each year. So that's a lot. So geological processes act on the carbon cycle in very long periods of time, but we also have a short-term carbon cycle. And this has to do with photosynthesis and respiration. To grow, organisms require both carbon and energy. Because we're living organisms, we are carbon-based organisms, so we need carbon for our survival. Photosynthetic organisms convert energy from the sun into ATP, which they use to reduce carbon dioxide to sugar. And you learned about this last semester in Bio 150. Photosynthetic organisms remove an estimated 210 billion metric tons of carbon from the atmosphere each year, which is about 25% of the total atmospheric carbon dioxide. To balance this removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, cellular respiration takes place. And just a quick reminder, in this process, oxygen is used to oxidize organic molecules to carbon dioxide and water. The amount of carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere by photosynthesis and the amount returned by respiration are about equal. So that means that photosynthesis is continually converting carbon dioxide to organic molecules using energy from the sun, but at the same time, respiration is harvesting the chemical energy stored in organic molecules, releasing carbon dioxide and water in the process. So that's why we call this the short-term carbon cycle, because we have photosynthesis taking in carbon dioxide, releasing oxygen, and then we have respiration, which is taking in the oxygen and releasing the carbon dioxide. And so that process is cycling all the time. In 1958, the American chemist Charles Keeling began a program to monitor the atmosphere, specifically looking at carbon dioxide concentrations in the air over time. And this was the first time anybody had systematically measured the amount of carbon dioxide and how it might change over time. So he did this project in Hawaii, and he set up 5 towers, and he sampled the atmosphere every hour with an infrared gas analyzer. Within the first few years of his project, a pattern of seasonal oscillation became apparent. Carbon dioxide concentrations are highest in the spring, and then they decline by approximately 6 parts per million in the early fall. And so we could see this in this first figure. We're zooming in on a 1-year time frame or 2-year time frame, and you can see when we have reached the fall, we decrease our amount of carbon dioxide. And then as we increase into the spring and summer months, we increase the amount of carbon dioxide. And this pattern has stayed consistent over the past 50 years. The other pattern that became evident from Keeling's work is that there has been a steady increase in the atmospheric carbon over the last 50 years. The summertime removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere does not quite balance the increase in winter. And this results in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere on any given date is greater than 1 year earlier. In fact, there has been a 25% increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since he began his study in 1958. And we're going to watch a video from NASA now that shows how carbon cycles over the course of 1 year. So you can see how this pattern of seasonal oscillation is occurring.
Hi, this is Bill Putman. I'm a climate scientist at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. What you're looking at is a supercomputer model of carbon dioxide levels in the Earth's atmosphere. The visualization compresses 1 year of data into a few minutes. Carbon dioxide is the most important greenhouse gas affected by human activity. About half of the carbon dioxide emitted from fossil fuel combustion remains in the atmosphere, while the other half is absorbed by natural land and ocean reservoirs. In the Northern Hemisphere, we see the highest concentrations are focused around major emission sources over North America, Europe, and Asia. Notice how the gas doesn't stay in one place. The dispersion of carbon dioxide is controlled by the large-scale weather patterns within the global circulation. During spring and summer in the Northern Hemisphere, plants absorb a substantial amount of carbon dioxide through photosynthesis, thus removing some of the gas from the atmosphere. We see this change in the model as the red and purple colors start to fade. Meanwhile, in the Southern Hemisphere, we see the release of another pollutant, carbon monoxide. This is a gas that's both harmful to the environment and to humans. During the summer months, plumes of carbon monoxide stream from fires in Africa, South America, and Australia, contributing to high concentrations in the atmosphere. Notice how these emissions are also transported by winds to other parts of the world. As summer transitions to fall and plant photosynthesis decreases, carbon dioxide begins to accumulate in the atmosphere. Although this change is expected, we're seeing higher concentrations of carbon dioxide accumulate in the atmosphere each year. This is contributing to the long-term trend of rising global temperatures. The Orbiting Carbon Observatory 2, or OCO2, will be the first NASA satellite mission to provide a global view of carbon dioxide. OCO2 observations and atmospheric models like GEOS 5 will work closely together to better understand both human emissions and natural fluxes of carbon dioxide. This will help guide climate models toward more reliable predictions of future conditions across the globe.
Okay, I hope you found that video interesting. One of my favorite parts about watching it is if you look at the Amazon rainforest in Brazil, you can see it breathing every day. So you can see the levels of carbon dioxide increase and then decrease as photosynthesis is happening during the day, which I think is really cool. So how has atmospheric carbon dioxide changed over the history of the Earth? For long time scales, the natural variation in the carbon cycle can be very large. When comparing the carbon dioxide levels with the temperature change during the same time, we can see a correlation. So if we look here at this figure, the top part of the figure is showing the carbon dioxide level or concentration. And the second figure below is the temperature change. And so you can see that when we have higher levels of carbon dioxide, like such as in this location, we also have higher temperatures. So higher concentrations of carbon dioxide is correlated with warmer temperatures. And this is because carbon dioxide is a very effective greenhouse gas. And a greenhouse gas is a gas that allows incoming solar radiation to reach Earth's surface, but then it traps heat that is re-emitted from the land and the sea. And this is why greenhouse gases are contributing to climate change, because they're trapping that heat that normally would have been able to leave the surface of our planet. These two curves on this graph also correlate closely with periodic growth and decay of continental ice sheets. So you could see here when we have periods of glacial ice sheets, we have lower levels of carbon dioxide and lower temperatures. And one of the reasons is because that white ice is able to reflect a lot more of the heat, and so less carbon dioxide is being trapped in the atmosphere. It's actually instead being trapped in the ice. So we have our first question for today. The carbon dioxide level is blank during winter in the northern hemisphere compared to levels in the summer hemisphere. Is it A, lower, B, higher, or C, the same? So pause the video and answer the first question below. All right, we have another question. Which correlates most closely with net increases in carbon dioxide levels over the past 2 centuries? A, volcanic gases, B, carbon dissolved in the oceans, C, respiration, or D, human activities? So pause this video and answer the second question below. So now that we know how carbon is cycling through our ecosystems over short periods of time and longer geological time periods, it's important to think about why we care as biologists about the cycling of carbon. So how is the carbon cycle providing a framework for understanding basic features of ecology, biodiversity, and evolution? A food web is, or also called a food chain, is a linear transfer of carbon and energy from one organism to the next. And so we have different levels of organisms within our food web, and there's carbon being transferred from one group to the next. The basis of every food web are primary producers, which can be plants, bacteria, algae, anything that's harnessing the power of the sun in most ecosystems, and then producing carbon. In deep sea ecosystems and some other subterranean or underground ecosystems where there's no sunlight, bacteria can use things such as hydrothermic vents to produce the same energy, such as others do in light with photosynthesis. So primary producers generate organic compounds that will provide food for other organisms in their local environment. So primary producers, if we look at this picture here, are the first trophic level. Without them, no other organisms would be able to survive. Organisms that consume other living organisms for food are called consumers. And there's multiple levels of consumers in most food webs. Primary consumers consume primary producers, and biologists often call these organisms herbivores or grazers. So we have in our terrestrial ecosystem, so ecosystems on land, we have organisms such as grasshoppers, mice, ducks, other birds, and these organisms are feeding on plants or fruit or other products of plants, and that's how they're getting their energy. In an aquatic ecosystem, you have things such as krill and fish, which are feeding on primary producers such as seagrass, seaweeds, kelp, algae within that aquatic ecosystem. Secondary consumers are predators or scavengers that feed on primary consumers. Animals that eat other animals are called carnivores. And these organisms may provide food for still other carnivores, which generates successive tiers of consumers. So if we see here, we have our secondary consumers, and secondary consumers are eating our primary consumers. And then in this particular ecosystem, we have tertiary consumers, which are the fourth trophic level, and they're going to eat other carnivores. And so you can see how you can have multiple tiers within the system. The carbon that was originally fixed by photosynthesis is returned to the atmosphere by the respiration of fungi and other decomposers that break down dead tissue. So when all of these organisms die, whether they're plant or animal, they are going to then go and be decomposed and broken down by decomposers. And then when they're respiring, they're releasing that carbon that they have consumed back into the atmosphere. So we have our primary producers, which are typically our photosynthetic organisms, our primary consumers, which eat primary producers, secondary consumers, which eat primary consumers, and then tertiary consumers, which eat secondary consumers. And all of those are then eaten by decomposers once they die. The interaction among species transfer energy as well as carbon and other elements through ecosystems. So we were thinking about carbon, but energy is also transferred. Unlike carbon, energy does not cycle through an ecosystem. So new energy must continually be harvested from the environment to sustain the community. In essentially all ecosystems where sunlight is available, photosynthesis lies at the heart of this ecosystem function. When sunlight is absent, especially in the vast depths of the ocean, bacteria and archaeans fuel primary production by other chemical reactions. Some of the energy that's harvested by primary producers is stored as chemical bonds in organic molecules such as carbohydrates, and therefore is available to organisms at the next trophic level when they consume a primary producer. Because building organic molecules is not 100% energy efficient, and because organisms at one trophic level rarely consume all of the resources in the level below them, biomass and the energy it represents generally decrease from one trophic level to the next. And this results in a trophic pyramid, which you can see here. Trophic pyramids, or diagrams of terrestrial biomass, have a pyramid shape because the biomass of the primary producers, which are typically plants, you could see here, is generally greater than that of primary consumers, or the herbivores, whose biomass is then greater than that of secondary consumers, which are the predators of the herbivores, and so forth. This pattern of decreasing biomass occurs because the transfer of energy and biomass is inefficient. Because of wastes, work that an organism has to do to survive and grow and reproduce, and heat dissipation, only about 10% of the energy and biomass available at one trophic level is incorporated into the next level. In addition to sunlight, water, and nutrients, govern rates of primary production in most ecosystems. Because photosynthesis requires both carbon dioxide and water, the photosynthetic rate, or the amount of carbon dioxide fixed into organic matter at any given time interval, is closely tied to water availability. So if we look at this in more detail, we have our primary producers, which is about 1,000 kilogram of grasses in this particular ecosystem. The mice, which are our primary consumer, feed on these grasses, but there's only about 100 kilograms of mice. Then a predator, such as a snake, feeds on the mice, and there's 10 kilograms of snakes. And then our tertiary consumer, our hawk, will then eat the snake, and this is only 1 kilogram a hawk. And if you think about this, you've probably seen this without realizing it. When you go outside, the predominant organism that you see are primary producers. And then you're most likely to see herbivores, and then the largest tertiary consumers, those big predators, are not very common. They don't exist in very large numbers compared to the lower trophic levels. So, time for a question. Consider this food web shown. The minnow which is right here, is considered a what? A, primary producer, B, primary consumer, C, secondary consumer, or D, tertiary consumer. So pause the video and answer that question below. All right, one more question. The carbon cycled through a food web primarily comes from A, primary producers, B, consumers, or C, decomposers. So pause this video and answer the next question below. Carbon is not the only molecule that's cycling through our ecosystems. We also are worried about two other cycles, the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle. So we're going to talk about the nitrogen cycle first and then talk about the phosphorus cycle. Nitrogen is found primarily in the atmosphere. It actually makes up 78% of the gas in the atmosphere. But nitrogen is required for organisms to survive. Primary producers play a key role in the nitrogen cycle, as these organisms can assimilate the biologically usable nitrogen found in soil or water. And they do this by typically having a symbiotic nitrogen-fixing bacteria associated with their roots. Remember, we talked about this when we talked about plant form and function. So that assimilation happens because of that symbiotic relationship between the bacteria and the plant. Primary consumers obtain nitrogen from the primary producers at the same time that they obtain carbon from these organisms. So when a primary producer eats a plant, for example, so in this example, when the giraffe eats the leaves from the tree, the giraffe is then taking in that nitrogen from the plant. The same thing will happen then when the lion, which is the secondary consumer, eats the giraffe. It will then consume and get that nitrogen from the food it's eating. Decomposers are very important in the nitrogen cycle. They return nitrogen to the atmosphere by metabolic and exclusively microbial processes, such as denitrification, which is a form of anaerobic respiration in which nitrate, rather than oxygen, serves as the terminal electron acceptor. Also through nitrification, which is a chemiautotropic process that uses energy gained from the oxidation of ammonia or nitrate by oxygen, and finally by anemox, which is chemoautotrophy with energy gleaned from the reaction of ammonia and nitrate. Nitrogen fixation is essential for this cycle to occur. Without nitrogen fixing bacteria, primary producers cannot assimilate nitrogen. And so without that bacteria, organisms would not be able to survive as we know it. Phosphorus and nitrogen are the key limiting nutrients in most biomes, but their cycles are very distinct. While nitrogen is found largely in the atmosphere, phosphorus resides overwhelmingly in sedimentary rock. Although the nitrogen and phosphorus are both assimilated by primary producers, phosphorus does not provide electron donors or electron acceptors for energy metabolism. So the way that phosphorus enters primary producers is just as a phosphate ion, and that is just released by rocks through chemical weathering. So the primary producers can take up the phosphate ion from the weathering of rocks, and then that phosphate is then in the primary producers, and similar to nitrogen, then the primary consumer consumes that from eating the plants. The secondary consumer gets the phosphate ions from consuming primary consumers. So that's how phosphorus is transferred from one organism to the other. Then Decomposition eventually returns the phosphorus to the geological reservoir of the sediment. When life began, Earth's atmosphere and oceans contained little to no oxygen gas. Photosynthesis and cellular respiration cycle not only carbon dioxide, but also oxygen. When these processes are in balance, the oxygen generated by photosynthesis is also consumed by respiration. When some of the carbon generated is buried in sediments, oxygen production exceeds oxygen consumption. And this results in an increase in oxygen levels that can accumulate over time. The oxygen present on Earth results from the interactions through time between the carbon cycle and the moving of plate tectonics. Life does not just respond passively to changing environments. It can actually drive environmental change through time. So for example, the evolution of trees increased the size of the carbon reservoir on land and ushered in an important new mechanism for removing carbon from the air, which ultimately returns it to sedimentary rock. And that's the burial of plant material on land, which forms peat, and eventually over very long periods of time forms coal. So if we look here, this is what they think the oxygen levels used to be a very long time ago, billions of years ago. There was little to no oxygen. Then oxygen levels rose to 1% and to 10% of modern levels about 2.4 billion years ago. Oxygen levels did not increase to levels that humans could breathe until about 580 million years ago, which coincides with the first appearance of animals in the fossil record. Before that, their levels of oxygen were too low to meet the demands of respiration needed for animals. In the current century, humans are adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere at a high rate, warming Earth's surface by the greenhouse effect. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about in our last lecture, the Anthropocene. The remarkable diversity of life on Earth reflects the ecology and evolution of populations that interact to cycle carbon through our biosphere. So this is a figure from your book. It's the last figure in this chapter. And it's a really good way to synthesize all the information in this chapter because it talks about the different cycles that we talked about and also how these are cycled through organisms within the environment. So it's a good way to synthesize everything from this chapter. And one more question for today. On Earth, nitrogen is primarily found in blank, while phosphorus is primarily found in blank. Is it A, the atmosphere, and then sedimentary rock? Is it B, nitrogen is found in sedimentary rock and phosphorus is found in the atmosphere? Is it C, nitrogen is found in sedimentary rock and phosphorus is found in primary producers? Is it D, nitrogen is found in primary producers and phosphorus is found in sedimentary rock? Or is it E, nitrogen is found in the atmosphere and phosphorus is found in primary producers? So pause the video and answer the last question below. And that is it for this lecture. Don't forget to post any questions you have on the discussion board, email me, or attend Zoom office hours on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Don't forget to submit your clicker questions below, and I hope that this lecture made you appreciate plants even more than you already do after learning all about them earlier this semester. Have a great day.